Hello, Pod A students. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Chapter 3 in your textbook. Chapter 3 goes back and really talks about the roots of American democracy. How did we get to the point of writing a constitution, creating this new governing framework for this new nation that had just been created? So we're going to talk about some of the ideas and principles that developed over many centuries, that those ideas that the country was founded on and gave rise to a system of representative government based on rule of law and individual rights and liberties. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history. How did we get to the point of the writing of that Constitution? So that is our goal for today. So we know, kind of go back to ninth grade world history, how did we get to the point of even having this new nation? North and South America were discovered, right? You had monarchies and European nations who, once there is navigation and shipbuilding, there is exploration, right? And we know that those European nations start going and exploring and discovering new nations, including North and South America. And they start basically kind of land grabbing, right? They go and they carve up those continents, and they start establishing and sending people from those European countries to establish governments and communities, colonies in North and South America after the Spanish discovered them in 1492. But now let's talk a little bit about context. How do we really get to that point of a democracy? How do we get to the point of a new system of government and really declaring our independence from Great Britain and creating a U.S. Constitution? So the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are some of the most important political documents ever written. There are important historical figures that we discuss, like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, some of the most creative political thinkers of their time. But they didn't come up with all of these ideas all on their own. The people that were sort of the main architects of our most famous documents, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, are influenced by political ideas and teachings that are really rooted in ancient times. You could look as far back as ancient Greece and looking at the traditions of direct democracy to the Roman Republic for ideas on representative government. But there are some great thinking and writing of the Enlightenment thinkers that really influence how the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution are going to be framed. So we're going to talk a little bit about that here. We know that there are traditions and principles of English government had a big influence and impact on the political views in these American colonies, right? So even though those colonists eventually rebel against British rule, they had a great respect for English common law and Britain's constitutional system. So even before we talk about the Enlightenment, we have to kind of go back to things like the Magna Carta that defined rights and duties of English nobles and set limits on the monarch's power. And they had a constitutional system that was based on laws, customs, and practices that worked to limit the powers of government and guarantee people some certain basic rights. The Magna Carta was one of those documents, a charter, if you will, that forced the king and was forced on the king by English nobles who were really upset about all of the taxes and the arbitrary rule of a king and a monarch. So that Magna Carta is the kind of the first sort of constitutional document that we see that helps define the rights and duties of those nobles and seeks to limit a king's power. There were other ideas like rule of law, which we'll be talking about more, that were also present in that document. And for hundreds of years, the monarchs challenged those constitutional beliefs, and they often ignored or defined those principles that were set down in that charter or that document. So then the Enlightenment thinkers come to be, and there are a lot of contributions from these thinkers that influenced our system of government. Colonial leaders were strongly influenced by these ideas, this sort of intellectual movement during the 16 and 1700s. Enlightenment thinkers were really interested in the value of science and reason, logic, but not just for studying the natural world, but also looking at societies and governments. So thinkers like Voltaire from France and Hobbes and Locke from Great Britain were really interested in improving society and government. And we look to Hobbes and Locke when we talk about social contract theory. Remember social contract theory from your last chapter. We talked a little bit about this idea that social contract was this idea that people in society agreed to give up some of their freedoms to governments in exchange for security and order, so that there really could be this agreement between government and the governed, and the idea that people would give up some of that freedom and they would agree to follow their ruler, but in exchange for that obedience, that ruler should bring them safety and peace and order. And really, John Locke takes it an even step further because he talks about the right to life, to liberty, and the ownership of property, which will come up in a very famous document by Thomas Jefferson. But he talks about how social contract was provisional, that if that ruler failed to protect life, liberty, and property of the people, then the people had the right to overthrow that ruler and establish a new government. And the idea that that purpose of government was to protect the rights of the people became a very powerful influence on colonial thinkers. And eventually it's going to be used to help justify the American Revolution. So let's start with a little bit more context, right? A little history lesson. So we know that the colonists gathered ideas about government from a lot of different sources and tradition, but they didn't all come from ancient history or European philosophy. A lot of them were shaped by everyday lives in colonial America. So most of the 13 colonies were established under kind of royal charters issued by the king, which basically mean that the king had ultimate power and his appointed officials, but because the colonists were so far away, those charters left a lot of local control in the hands of the colonists themselves. So they're there living their lives. A lot of the colonies have developed their own governing structure. They had their own sort of executive, legislative, and judicial branches. They had governors, usually appointed by the king, but they had a lot of power, and there was some lawmaking and things that they were doing on their own. Those colonial assemblies weren't really what we would consider democracy today, but they did have a belief and reflected a belief in self-government. So some of that had been going on. So by the mid-1700s, the colonies were pretty used to managing their own affairs. And although Great Britain provided them with a military and defense and a market for their economies, for products produced in those colonies to then be sent back to Europe, Great Britain really didn't interfere much with the day-to-day business of government. And all of that changes, though, in 1763, after the French and Indian War. So the British win the French and Indian War. We know that war costs a lot of money, so they amass a war debt, but they also gained a lot of new territory. And that territory had to be protected and governed. And typically countries pay for war and they pay for defense and governing through revenue collected by taxes, right? Generated, I should say, and collected through taxes. And that's essentially what happens is the British government argues that the colonies should be paying some of the cost of this added defense for this new land, this new property, and Parliament starts enacting things like the Stamp Act, and starts collecting taxes on a variety of things, things like mortgages and liquor license and playing cards and newspapers, and the colonists are outraged. They see the stamps as a form of taxation. They really believed that at that point only elected representatives could tax them. Therefore, the colonies, because they didn't have any representation in Parliament, which was in Great Britain, legislative body, they felt that the taxes were illegal. And that's where we get this idea of taxation, no taxation without representation. And the colonists are pretty united in protest against the Stamp Act. The British government repeals this act, but they continue trying to control the colonies through taxes and other measures. And it's sort of this back and forth between protest and agitation and more rules and more authority, and things just continue. And at this point, Parliament is imposing sanctions. These harsh penalties just further inflame the colonial resistance to British rule. And we see the meeting of the First Continental Congress shortly after this. So we've got colonists who are resentful. They see restrictions against their liberties. It's a king who's an ocean away. Parliament is out of touch with what we're doing. We've been running this on our own. Maybe we don't need to be under this system of government anymore. Maybe there's a way that we can figure this out. So there are tensions already when the First Continental Congress meets in 1774, but the goal was a peaceful opposition to these British policies, right? Let's gather, let's talk about, peaceful opposition. But a lot of colonial patriots were already forming militias or armed citizens to defend their rights. And on April 19th, 1775, militia troops clashed with British soldiers in the battles at Lexington and Concord, and this becomes the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So we see fighting before the Second Continental Congress can convene in May of 1775, and the American Revolution has begun. So during the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775, fighting has already broke out in Massachusetts. The delegates quickly vote to create an army, this Continental Army made up of volunteers from the colonies, and they choose George Washington to lead and become the Army's commanding officer. At this point, there is more and more discussion about writing a formal Declaration of Independence, and a committee is formed in June of 1776 to draft the Declaration of Independence. You've got Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert R. Livingston, and they are going to write about what is important to them and to create this sort of break from Great Britain and ultimately create a new basis of government, which comes to be called as the Articles of Confederation, and that is our government until after the war was over. So we'll come back to the Articles in a second, but let's talk more just for a minute about the Declaration of Independence. We know that Thomas Jefferson is the main architect of the Declaration of Independence. A lot of his ideas, though, come from John Locke and social contract philosophy. I mentioned some of those, kind of direct quotes, this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, very familiar to some things that come up from those Enlightenment thinkers. And Jefferson creates this vision for a new kind of nation. He didn't want it to be based on conquest. He wanted this new nation to be born from protecting people's unalienable rights, and also kind of defining those rights as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the second idea was that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that would really be that social contract piece, that there is consent and a balance between those things. We see a formal Declaration of Independence as to what we now celebrate as Independence Day, July 4th, 1776. The members of Congress formally approved the Declaration of Independence, and it was later written for the delegates to sign, and by signing it, they were making a formal declaration of war against what was then Great Britain, the most powerful nation on earth. So fighting goes on. The fighting with Great Britain goes on for about 5 years, eventually ending in 1781 with the surrender of the British Army at Yorktown, Virginia. During that time, the Continental Congress served as the nation's government. It was raising troops. It was supplying for the war. It was borrowing money. It was negotiating treaties with foreign countries. And most of it was done without any sort of constitution. So after declaring independence, Congress creates a committee to work on the Articles of Confederation. And that is kind of our Constitution in the meantime. So this Articles of Confederation, because of its past history with Great Britain, it was just kind of the plan that was drafted during the war, and then each of the 13 states also needed a constitution. In framing these ideas of government, they were very committed to this idea of constitutionalism, or the idea that government should be based on an established set of principles. Things like popular sovereignty, limited government, rule of law, separation of powers. All of those go on to become really the 6 principles of the Constitution that we'll talk more about in this unit. Another piece that was really important to the states was this idea of individual rights, and we'll come back to that as well. But know that when the articles are created, there were some concerns over a strong central government. They wanted more of a loose confederation. Most of the powers remained at the state level. The government created under the Articles consisted only of a Congress, members chosen by the states. There wasn't an executive to carry out laws or a judicial branch to settle any legal questions. There was no system or power to levy taxes, so they couldn't really raise the money that they needed to support the Continental Army, and were borrowing pretty heavily to fund the revolution. And at the end of the war, they had no way to raise funds then to repay any of those debts. So it was pretty clear that the Articles of Confederation, as they were written, weren't going to work. So by 1786, it was clear that the Articles weren't working and they needed to meet, and they needed to call for this constitutional convention in the following year in Philadelphia. So during that convention, and this begins on May 25th, 1787, the Constitutional Convention begins. There's delegates from all the states except Rhode Island come together in Pennsylvania. They meet in the same room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years before that. There were all kinds of different personalities and experience, but no one was more integral in the writing of the Constitution. No one played a greater role than James Madison. So much so that we refer to him as the father of the Constitution for his role in shaping this new governing framework. So one of the first things that the delegates did was elect George Washington as the convention's presiding officer. They also talk about rules for procedures. Some of the video clips that we show in class kind of talk about how hot and humid it was and how they shut all the doors and shut all the windows. It was very important that they kept everything very private. They didn't want the public to pressure them or have any of that public pressure affecting their decisions. And one of the first things that they need to figure out is what's going to be the plan for this new constitution? How are they going to organize this new system of government? So the Virginia delegates, who favored a strong national government, put forth this plan, and it was written mainly by James Madison, clearly designed to replace the Articles, not revise them. Calls for a government of 3 branches. Legislative branch would make the laws, executive branch would carry out the laws, judicial branch would interpret the laws. But under this Virginia plan, the government would be bicameral, so 2-house legislature. And they talked about how representation in both houses should be based on population. It would give the more populous states more representation and then more influence than the states with smaller populations. The New Jersey plan, on the flip side, is introduced by William Patterson in New Jersey this alternative approach. He says, well, what about small states? They don't have as much population. They shouldn't lack representation. So maybe the Articles of Confederation should be amended to have a one-house legislature in which all states have equal representation. It's fair, it's equal, and the delegates from smaller states are on board with this plan. They debate, and long story short, they ultimately agree upon a compromise designed to satisfy both sides. This plan calls for bicameral legislature, so different form of representation in each house. The Senate would represent equal representation for the states. Every state gets 2. In the House of Representatives, states would be given representation based on population. And this plan gets known as the Great Compromise. So that basically resolves this issue of representation in Congress and allows this convention to move forward. There are other compromises, though, that need to be made on slavery and commerce. Another butting of heads came between northern and southern states. Many of the northern delegates want a constitution that includes provisions to abolish slavery. Southerners, whose agricultural economy was successful because of slavery, stood in opposition. And they basically wanted 2 different plans. The South wanted slaves to be counted when determining representation in the House. The North wants slaves to be counted for taxation, but not representation. And this goes on to create a lot of problems, which we'll talk more about in class when we talk about the impact that slavery has on the history of our country and the history of our economic success in this country. So, for purposes of both taxation and representation, ultimately the delegates compromise, and they create something called the 3/5 compromise. This provision, although it allowed the writing of the Constitution to move forward, contradicts the basic ideals of equality that were laid out in the Declaration of Independence. Other protections for slavery that are also embedded in the Constitution include no restrictions on domestic slave trade. So basically, residents of one state could still sell slaves to other states. It required the states to return fugitives to the states where they had been charged with crimes, which therefore prevented any slaves from trying to escape or gain freedom to escape to states that had abolished slavery. And then the Fugitive Slave Clause is something that's also included in the Constitution that allowed slave owners to reclaim human property in states where those slaves had fled. So the contradiction between the democratic ideals and the inequality of slavery is something that still haunts our nation and really tarnishes the legacy of so many historians and famous architects of these documents, that was something that they still prioritized and ultimately sacrificed in order to get the Constitution on to the next steps and get it closer to ratification. So ultimately, that 3/5 compromise allowed slaves to be counted as 3/5 of all free persons. So 5 slaves was equal to 3 votes, essentially. And we don't see changes in that for quite a few years into the passing of the Constitution. Other barriers to ratification, you kind of had 2 different perspectives that kept the Constitution from being ratified for a period of time. So the Constitution did include a provision for ratification, so that in order for it to go into effect, they basically had to have 9 of the 13 states ratify. And ratification was to take place at the state level, at state conventions made up of delegates that were elected for that purpose. So pro-ratification effort was led by supporters of the Constitution that refer to themselves as Federalists. They favor a strong federal government that shared power with the states. Opposition are known as the Anti-Federalists. They preferred more of a loose association of the states established under the Articles of Confederation. They wanted more states' rights. They were very concerned that the national government was going to be too powerful, and they also wanted a Bill of Rights. They wanted to be sure that individual rights were represented. They were very fearful that a strong national government would lead to tyranny, and they argue that the states should really hold most of the power. Ultimately, there are some agreements made, and that essentially the promise of a Bill of Rights and the promise of some states' rights, specific things given to the states, was really what moves the Constitution forward. So by January 1788, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey had ratified the Constitution. Georgia and Connecticut follow shortly after. Massachusetts, however, ratifying convention deadlocked over that lack of a Bill of Rights. They agreed to ratify only after receiving assurance that those rights would be added after ratification. So by the summer of 1788, all but 2 states had ratified, and so the Constitution was now in effect. And we see that supreme law of the land help ensure rule of law, that it was applied to everyone. And the Constitution is our new body of government moving forward. So constitutions ratified in 1788. 3 years later, they approve a Bill of Rights intended to protect civil liberties and to again meet the promise, the assurances that were given in order for those other states who were hesitant to agree to ratify. So James Madison, again, father of the Constitution, drafts a series of amendments to protect individual rights, and the Bill of Rights is ratified by the states in 1791 and became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we will talk more about in class this week. So, thank you. Hopefully now you have a little bit better understanding of the history. Where have we been? How did we get to the Constitution? And now we are going to dig in more specifically to the document itself and what is included in it and into the Bill of Rights. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you later.